First of all, people that are my colleagues out there who listen to this, and some people who have worked for me, with me, people I've worked for, would probably laugh out loud when they hear what I say to this. But I think my superpower is being an empath.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Smells Like Identity Hygiene. I'm your host, Rosario Mastrogiacomo, and today we have Greg Nicastro. Greg, welcome, and can we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Rosie. Thanks for the invite, by the way. I love the title of this podcast. Why don't I start with what I do today, and then I'll give you a little bit of background beyond that. So currently I serve as an operating partner at Edison Partners. We're a growth stage private equity firm based in Nashville and Princeton, and we focus on finding diamonds in the rough like Sphere. I run the Product and Tech Center of Excellence for Edison's value creation business. We call it the Edison Edge. And I do a number of different things. I coordinate diligence on new portfolio companies. I assist with what we call 180-day plans that kind of take the things that we found during diligence and help the new portco address those things. And I try to build community amongst the CTOs and CPOs within the Edison portfolio, so they have more colleagues in their network that if they want help with something, assistance, particular type of expertise, they can get it. I also do some independent work, so with companies in and around the security space, and again, it's a combination of fractional CPTO work, consulting and advisory. Some of my clients include BitSight, Onapsis, and I also am an advisor to Hyper. You may know some of those names. So that's what I'm doing today. I got into all of this a long time ago in a galaxy far away. So I got started in the early 80s. And I've had primarily, for the last 30 plus years, I've had primarily, product management and engineering leadership roles. And rather than step through all of that stuff and bore everyone with that, I won't. I'll just focus in on a couple of different things in terms of where I learned, what I know about security, right? So back in the late 90s, I ran a cybersecurity consultancy and managed services business at a company called Predictive Systems. And we took that company public in the late 90s. And then we acquired another company called Global Integrity from SAIC. And Global Integrity was one of the, at the time, one of the leading information security consultancies. And the reason I raise it is because I had an opportunity to learn a lot about security from people that some people listening to this podcast might know today because they're still around working in our industry. So Anish Bhamani, for example, who's a former chief risk officer at JPMC, and I think he's just one of the CTOs or CIOs at JPMC today. Ed Scotus, who's the president of SANS, Errol Weiss, who's a CISO at the healthcare ISAC. So these guys, the reason I raised this, and it's been a while, right? But I've stayed in touch with them. They helped me learn, what I know about the security space. And then the second thing I thought that would be useful in terms of context is I ran product and technology at Veracode for almost 6 years prior to our acquisition by Computer Associates. And so I got, again, in-depth, much more insider perspective from experts like Chris Wysopal, who you can, his handle's Weld Pond, highly respected and one of the real innovators. Started Veracode, but has been an innovator in AppSec for a long time. And Chris Eng, who ran security research for them for about 17 years. So that's where I kind of learned what I know about it through some really smart people and over a reasonably long period of time. So that's some background. So my focus area is product and technology, but sort of my minor is cybersecurity.
Thanks, Greg. That was fantastic. And I have been looking forward to this conversation. I think mostly because, and as we've talked over the years, I feel like this conversation might get a little philosophical at times, which is fantastic, whether we're talking about product management or security in general. But let's start with product management, right? So you talked about engineering, product management. Of course, product managers, people who build the software, or at least gather the requirements for the software that needs to be built, think about security, have to think about security. But how should a product manager today think about the security or building security into the applications that they're building?
Yeah. So I'd start by saying that, look, there was a time that it was, barely relevant, right? Nobody was really paying much attention to it. And that was probably in the 90s, okay? And then when SaaS became the thing, it became much, much more important, right? So if you're building a SaaS offering today, it's a significant requirement. It's not just, if you will, a subset of quality, right? To me, it's a core feature, and the reason I say that is, without it, it's going to be very difficult to sell into the large enterprises. I'll give a kind of an interesting example, I think, anyway, that coming up in my career. At one point, I was an executive at Iron Mountain, and we had a Iron Mountain digital business that had a PC data protection and recovery solution. And we're trying to sell it into Boeing. And this is still a little while ago now. This is like in 2007, 2008. And we couldn't sell and I was responsible for product and tech at Iron Mountain at the time. And we couldn't sell into Boeing without getting what was called Veracode verified at the time. And again, this is, like I said, like 2007, 2008, when they were still a young company. I'd never even heard of Veracode before at the time, and they were kind of pioneering SaaS-based application security testing. So to me, that was sort of the beginning of what's today critically important. If you're serious about software development, you got to be able to prove that your apps are secure, and you have to be able to make sure you can show a process, particularly if you're selling into enterprises, right? For app security. So I don't know if that answers it, but that's a
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, and this is under the category of one of those philosophical questions. Do you think the idea of people being more mindful of security, particularly product managers, right? Compliance people, security people, that's their role. They've always been mindful and thinking about security. You think it was the move to the cloud and that kind of idea that, okay, well, now our application is going to be exposed, so we need to protect it better. You think that's really kind of what kind of is driving or has driven product managers to be more security minded? Or is it the fact that breaches have become, something that is in the regular news, right? It's not something that is hidden away in some technology blog or technology press. It's something that you see on the regular mainstream news, and it becomes something that everyone is more aware of.
Yeah, I mean, both, right? To me, it's both. I remember, in the early days, of AppSec, there was a lot of what we would call soup is good food, like trying to convince somebody that this is a problem worth solving. And then with a series of various breaches over the years, and also, as we discussed, this movement to SaaS. And SaaS, to me, is another way to describe the application at that time, the application as the new perimeter, okay, from a security perspective. So I think both those things collaborate to make this critically important and front and center, for product folks. At the same time, by the way, you had a shift left movement going on in engineering, and meaning, it's simply my definition of shift left is it's cheaper to find problems with your software sooner in your development lifecycle. I think everybody kind of knows that intuitively, but we overcomplicate it. So the shift left was not only, instead of inspecting, trying to inspect quality in with security being a part of quality, now we're trying to design it in, right? So I think you had two different things going on at the same time, which was great. You had product managers seeing, market drivers for it, like breaches, like the app as the new perimeter. And then you had engineering related best practices and what does good engineering look like with shift left, right? So those things together, I think, conspired to make this, is as important as it is today.
And maybe like 20 years ago, the extent of, or maybe even longer, the extent, or even shorter, the extent of you thinking about security is I got to figure out how a user logs into this application. Whereas now you probably, and that would be the extent of it, right? The user logs in, maybe what is the capability of that user? But now you have to think beyond that and think about, well, who should be able to do X versus Y within my application, not in the context of giving the usability of the user, making the usability of the application better for the user, but ultimately to protect the data that user is working with in the application. So it almost becomes like a product manager has to think the way that a security person thinks, right? The way an audit person thinks, the way that, to some extent, the way that the attacker would think of where can I compromise this, and then how do I build those barriers around that, right?
Absolutely. All true, agreed.
So what do you think, what elements of security, whether it's breaches, whether it's cloud, what do you think were the elements that really has had the biggest impact in how a product manager and how an engineering team builds software, right? That has affected, either slowed them down, sped them up, but what has had the biggest impact on the process of building software?
Well, I think it's just a part of what I said earlier, right? Which is this idea that, look, in modern software development, you want to be able to deploy, valuable, customer-facing functionality sooner, right? So how do we do that in a, secure, compliant, performant, right, and rich way? And I think this whole, movement toward sort of the, you probably, some of the listeners are probably familiar with, Gene Kim and some of the DORA folks, the DevOps Research and Assessment folks out of Google now. Didn't start at Google, but they're really driving the drivers behind it these days. Security became an important part of that whole model, right? So the idea of shifting left on security, and so when in part of the way we evaluate development organizations today, software delivery performance specifically, is on some of these metrics. And you're not going to be able to deploy frequently if you don't deploy securely. Let's put it that way. So I think, and that's a big part of the push for more value more quickly. But it's got to be secure. So how do you do that? And again, I thought the requirements have been there for a while to say, hey, we got to build secure applications. And if that means it takes us a little bit longer to do it, then it's going to take us a little bit longer to do it. I think what the DORA folks tried to, figure out and push into that in terms of some of their research was, hey, it's beyond that. It's actually, you're going to be able to deploy more frequently if you're more secure, right? And less expensively on so many different levels, because think about it. When we used to think about, shift left for quality, that was, the orientation was towards functional bugs that you end up having to fix in production, which are necessarily more expensive, right, to fix. But now what we're talking about is a potential breach. When you think about, data at risk, you think about the brand and, damage that can be done, the money lost from that standpoint, depending on the organization, the stakes are higher, So meanwhile, the stakes are higher, but the requirements to generate value more quickly are higher, right? So I don't know if that's a over answer, but that's kind of the way I would think about it.
And I guess, if we think about the process of building software for the outside world, right? So you're a vendor, you're selling software versus building software for your internal consumers. You work at, a large bank, you work at a financial, another organization, and you're building software for your end users. I feel like those lines are blurred, right? It used to be very different kind of the workflow, the code that you're writing might be the same, but from a security mindset, right? If you're building code that's inside your walls and it's well protected, you got the walls, you got the firewalls, you got the security team taking care of the security. I could build software and maybe not think about security as much as, well, I'm building a SaaS application, right? Or I'm building an application that is going to be used by the outside world. I have to do extra work to make sure that it's secure. I feel like at this stage, especially with cloud, with SaaS applications being built for internal consumption, I feel like that line is blurred. Do you feel it's the same way? Like the distinction between how you build software for internal use, just your company, versus building software that you're actually looking to sell?
Yeah. So I think that SaaS has raised the bar for usability as one category, right? But it's raised the bar across the board, right? Because, what do consumers expect out of an application, right? And how quickly do they leave a site if they don't get the performance, or if they hear that somebody got hacked as a result, or, so I think that we used to be able to, frankly, get away with internal-facing applications for some pragmatic reasons, right? I mean, that there is a level of security behind a set of firewalls and, all the kind of protections you would get in a large enterprise, for example. But to me, it's really, the standards got raised, okay, across both sort of features and non-functionals, right? And so now you can't get away with building an internal app that's insecure or difficult to use or doesn't perform, because in people's normal lives, they're dealing with SaaS systems that hopefully, are responsive to both the functional and non-functional, including security and the non-functional side. So I think that's what it is. I think the expectations and the standards have risen for internal-facing apps on a number of levels.
Yeah, and it's funny how you see the consumer apps kind of having an effect on the business apps, right? Why can't you make it as simple as my iPhone? Why can't you make it as simple as Instagram? And if you look at things like what's happened to Office, as an example, you have the share button, just like you had the share button in Instagram and Facebook and social media applications. And it's like, people are used to being able to just share something with their contacts. And now they could do that within the application. So that usability, that kind of user friendliness, business users, I agree, are expecting that same experience, right? There's really no excuse. And then from a security perspective, you got to protect my data. You got to protect the environment, right? You got to protect the organization.
All of that. Agree with all of that.
So when we talk about the concept of identities, right? So in the process of building, especially building cloud applications, where you're talking about service accounts, non-human accounts, API keys, the ways that these systems talk to each other. Talk a little bit about how that plays into, from a security perspective, how that plays into kind of the understanding of where how software is being built, and how you have to think about those identities, and how you have to think about how these things talk to each other in the process of ultimately just releasing
it's
some
a critical topic in security broadly, and specifically in application security. I mean, whether we're talking about who's able to access an app and what they're authorized to do with it, or when multiple applications are communicating via APIs, right? The same notions, right, of identity and access authorization apply. And I think one big push in our industry for probably the last 10 years has been API-driven development work, right? So making sure that all those connections are secure and work from the perspective of, identification and authentication and authorization is front and center for most development teams. So that's what I'd say about it. I mean, it's become, it's been critical for a long time, but it's become more and more critical as we think in terms of, applications that are really built to communicate with each other, and the opportunity for, hey, is that app actually, is it okay for app A to communicate with app B, and on what terms, and then what can it do once it's interacting there? I mean, all those things are front and center. They also, so they're also kind of part of when you think about, how something might be attacked or breached. All of that stuff has to kind of factor into it, right? When you're planning out how you're going to build something, it starts really at the architecture level. So again, that's how I would reply to that. I think, yeah, it's down the middle, it's front and center, it's critically important. It's not that it's perfect by any stretch, but at least it's front and center for everybody that's thinking about building these applications.
Right, and as we think about the proliferation of SaaS and cloud-based applications, even if you're building internal applications in your organization, these identities that you're creating, whether it's service accounts or certificates, API keys, tokens, whatever it is, to some extent, you're causing more of a security issue as these things are growing, right? Because Gartner will say machine identities are growing exponentially faster than human identities, which makes sense. But at the same time, the challenge for engineering teams, product management teams is how do we also build secure applications while we have this need, because they're not creating all these identities because, let's just create as many identities as we can. There's a need to do that in the way that you build software these days. So my question for you is that this idea of understanding the security, not just how do we secure this application, how do we build a secure application, but also having that understanding of let's be responsible for these identities that we're creating. Who do you think the majority of that responsibility falls on? Is it the product manager writing those requirements and saying this is what the application needs to be? Or is it the engineering team that says, wait, product manager, what you're asking for is going to cause a security issue. We need to do it this way, not that way, because we're going to introduce.
So again, not to be a bore when I respond to your questions, but I do think it's a both. I think first and foremost, the product manager needs to make sure that the engineering team understands that it's critically important to them, okay? And when you say that, that usually means you're willing to make trade-offs with engineering to make sure it gets done. So it's one thing to say, hey, that's really important. It's another thing to say, I'll trade this off against that. So I think it starts there. They've got to be hip to that, and they've got to be able to stand behind that with their engineering counterparts. The second part of it is down the middle of the plate for engineering, probably assisted by some folks that are specialized, have specialized training in and around, secure development of API-driven applications, for example. We're kind of focusing on that part of it. Because look, not every developer is going to be hip to all that stuff. They're not necessarily going to know what questions to ask. Whoever's supporting them from an architecture standpoint should be able to, and or, a security expert that works with the development teams. So I think that combination is ultimately on the hook for the execution part of it, but it has to start with the product, side of the house saying, yeah, this is really important to us, and we're willing to sacrifice potentially time and or other functional, capabilities to be able to get this built into everything we do. So, yeah, that's how I would think about it.
If you had to think about like the years that you've been working with either organizations where you work with in your current capacity, or where you were running the engineering teams, running the product management teams, can you think about when that shift happens where security, I would imagine, like you said, go back many years ago, security probably wasn't even discussed. Exactly. It's like, oh yeah, we'll create a login and go into the application. When do you think it actually started shifting where security became a main part of the conversation in those design meetings, in those discussions? Yeah. You say like 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Was it really SaaS? Like when that really kind of introduced that?
So if I think about timelines, so I think about it was a non-factor, unfortunately, in a lot of the 90s. So if I go back then that far, it became a big factor through some combination of SaaS and visible breaches So call that 2000 to 2010, right? And then from 2010 to now, again, and it's become critically important, highly visible. But the other caveat here is it depends on the organization. What we typically see, and even in the private equity world, right? Firms that are further along, okay, and more mature in terms of their size and the folks they've got to do development work and the various pieces of expertise, okay, the further along they are, the higher priority something like application security or, via identity, in part via identity management, becomes, and it's practical for them. The real small startups, they struggle because they're just trying to get something out to market. So if I think about venture capital model versus the private equity model, private equity players are more mature in this regard than startups, because the startup is trying to figure out, independent of how secure the thing is, whether or not anybody wants to buy it, right, Rosie? I mean, like, they start with that. But so what I would say is, call it from 2000 to 2010 to 2025, continues to mature. Larger companies are better at this, and who have more resources to invest in it and more ability to hire experts than the smaller companies. Even though the smaller companies understand technically what they actually should be doing. Okay, they don't always do it from an affordability standpoint, and they take the risk relative to brand damage, potentially not getting another round of finance, whatever it is. So you see more in the more mature companies. Okay, and when I say that, I'd say that's true across independent software vendors and also large software-enabled enterprises. And almost all the big enterprises are software-enabled now, right?
Yeah, I wonder if you were to chart that out in terms of kind of the thinking about spending or actually doing something about security, the smaller, because of the resources, like you said, they don't have the resources to do it. Maybe the middle is where they have the resources and they're still agile enough to actually do it. I wonder though, if as you get bigger, the bureaucracy, the kind of the mammoth organization, and some of these applications where the developer left 20 years ago, I wonder if those are still completely unsecure just because it's gotten so big that it's hard to make that kind of change or to kind of implement the kind of change, whether it's internal politics, whether it's bureaucracy, or just the fact that there's no one around that knows how that
and sure,
thing
that's
works.
out there. And where I think the risk became, and this reminds me of something, part of what I did at Iron Mountain was not only, I had the Iron Mountain digital business from a product strategy, product management standpoint, but I also had the engineering team on the core Iron Mountain side that builds their internal facing applications. And what we were doing at that time is trying to expose more of them to the web so folks could self-serve, right? So if you wanted somebody to come, shredding truck to come by and pick, et cetera, right? We used to do all that stuff internally. We used to support internal service teams, and we needed to expose all that to take cost out of the model and make it more responsive to what customers really wanted. And that would be an example, right? And what we do best we could is, use identity and access management, because we weren't re-engineering the software, right? We were just sort of putting a veneer over it to give people access to it, and we tried to improve it so that they could actually use it, right, from a usability standpoint. So I'm sure there's a lot of that still going on. I mean, I was doing that in like 2007, 8, 9. So I know that there's a lot of that, that's still going on at some of the bigger enterprises. They can only touch certain parts of what they've got, pragmatically speaking, because of what you described. Some of the code's been sitting there. The person that wrote it is long gone, and there's no meaningful documentation around it. So what are you going to do, right? So you try to make it, as safe as you can, given the circumstances.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen at Sphere is that idea of, if you think about, just like you said, SaaS, if you were migrating an existing application or building something brand new and you were building it right for cloud, whether it's, an application you plan to sell, or more realistically, in this case, an application that's for internal use, it's going to be secure by default because, number one, you're going to think about security now compared to 20 years ago. And number two, there are things with building applications in a tenant, in a SaaS environment, where it almost forces you to be secure, right? Because it gives you the defaults that are the more secure than kind of, just go off on your own and do what you want. And what we're seeing is that those legacy applications, those legacy servers, virtual machines, network devices, whatever it is, because they were built 20, 30, 40 years ago, they are less secure, right? And the on-prem environment is much, much less secure than what you move to cloud. Cloud is when everyone was thinking about security. So when you're doing a lift and shift, you're cleaning up, right? You're building directly into that environment. But all that legacy stuff that's just lingering in those data centers are ripe for the picking for the person that would do you harm, right? And for the most part, they're being ignored because everyone's thinking, oh, well, we're going to the cloud anyway. Don't worry about that stuff. We're going to migrate that application. Yeah, mainframes have also been going away for 30 years, and there's still plenty of mainframes, right?
Yeah. So on that point, though, just a quick comment on that point, is that, look, when AWS was really, obviously AWS is the gorilla in this, superscaler space, but they started up, like, at least in my lifetime, business lifetime, they were nothing, and then they became something, right? And one of their big arguments was, a lot of the big enterprises didn't want to go to AWS, and because of security. And ironically, just based on some of what you just said, it didn't take long to prove to people that you were, in a lot of ways, more secure at an AWS. I just use them as an example, but you could fill in the blank with Azure, you could fill in the blank, with Google Cloud Platform probably. I mean, all of those three. Than you were in your own shop, in part because of what you described.
Yeah. So, the funny thing is we actually have this similar issue around, it comes down to SMEs, right? Your subject matter experts. If I could understand if you're like, Fortune 5, you could make the argument, well, I have the resources to manage my data center, manage my security, my infrastructure security, just as well as AWS, just as well as Microsoft or Google. But if you're like a mid-level company, are you really going to be able to hire the kinds of people that are managing that data center the way that your cloud providers can? Probably not, right? They probably have access to a lot more resources than you have, and it is more secure. But the flip side of that is that if you are an organization that is in the process of migrating, right? So everyone's always in a data transformation, right? Digital transformation. We've been in digital transformations probably when the first typewriter was retired and replaced with a Wise terminal. But you're in that constant state of data transformation, and it's not like you just turn off old technology and turn on new. That old technology lingers, right? And that's why mainframes are still around. That's why it's going to take years before people just shut down their data centers. And while you're building something that is super secure, potentially, and well protected in the cloud, I feel like for the most part, people are kind of ignoring the on-prem stuff. And not thinking about that because of this idea of, well, it's going away. But that is where you will be attacked.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, right? The other point there is that a lot of the monolithic apps that were built for a particular timetable and environment, even if you wanted to move those to the cloud, they're gonna be expensive to run in the cloud.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because you can't take advantage of what the real value of the cloud is, right? It isn't just, and this will date me a little bit, but that's probably obvious anyway. There was a day when there was time sharing, right? Before there was cloud computing.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out very well because in a lot of ways, time sharing was like lift and shift. But that's another topic and probably only relatable to those listening that are in my age group or maybe even older.
So going back to building software, can you think of, in 2025, right, what makes building software today so difficult? It doesn't have to be about security, just in general, what makes building software really, really difficult these days?
Yeah, okay, well, in thinking about this one, So here's what I'd say. The difficult part is building what people want to buy on a timescale of relevance, meaning making sure that you're not pissing away valuable development resources on things that ultimately don't meet the mark relative to some combination of business value, usability, et cetera, right? And so to me, it's like, think about all the features built into applications that you use every day that you don't even know about and will never use. Okay, so I think the hardest part today of building is starting with, are we building the right thing? Because I'm sort of like a one-note piano player on this in our portfolio. How much engineering time are we wasting building things that we don't have proof of value around, right? But there's plenty of people asking, hey, Greg, how can we become more productive and efficient in engineering? It's not just engineering, right? It starts with, are we building the right thing? So I guess I'd say that a more specific reason is that the standards for usability, in particular performance, it's what we were a little bit about what we were talking about earlier, are way higher. So whether it's in an enterprise or a consumer app, people have no patience, right, or time to help you make your user interface or performance better. They're like, hey, this sucks, I'm gone, right?
Right.
So I think that that's part of why it's hard. You can argue that there's so many different potential ways to architect things and implement them, et cetera. But again, I'm sort of biased because I think back to, when I was, trying to become a software developer a long time ago, the tools we had then to build compared to what's available now, it's like night and day. It's laughable. So sometimes it's hard for me to have empathy, it's a complex environment, but if you can pick the right tools, there's a lot more available to you, and you should become more productive and efficient as a result. Like, as we've seen even most recently with AI, right? With Copilot, some of the tools that are available now that have sprung up over the last couple of years to make it easier, I think, to thread through some of all the tools and become productive out the other end of that. So anyway, I don't know if I kind of roundabout answered your question, but I think it kind of starts with, are we building the right thing or not, and how good are we at that?
I think the stat, I think it's 90% of all most users who use Excel do not use 90% of the functionality in Excel. I think that was the statistics. It was something ridiculous. Like, most of the functionality by the average user it is not used. The problem with something like a legacy application like that is that, well, you do have those group pockets of people that really, really rely on those things, and that you can't just get rid of them anymore, right? You can't just say, all right, I'm just going to get rid of the least common used functionality because, but if you're building something new, you have to think about that day one, right? Are we really, really building something that no one cares about? And no one wants, and we're going to spend all this money because it is money, right? And build it. And I guess that to end on a positive note, which you already answered some of it. What are some of the reasons why development today is easy? All I can say is I have no idea how anyone wrote a single line of code before Google existed. Right? Before Stack Trace and before being able to say, I'm getting this error, what do I do? It's difficult to imagine how anyone wrote a single line of code.
Right. So picture me. You asked the question, like, if you basically just asked it, right? Which is like, why is it easier? Like, I mean, we were still desk checking, okay? We were listings when I was in college. All right? It was so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask this, but we were lucky to get a CRT as opposed to a teleprinter to do our work on, okay, with a line-oriented editor. So you ask an old graybeard like me about this, and I'm going to be like, are you kidding me? This is child's play compared to the way it was. But so I would say a better answer would be the dev tools and the open source libraries, and the way you can leverage APIs. I mean, there's just, and on top of that, we've learned a lot more about good software development practices as well. So I think we're actually, I mean, the other thing that's more pragmatic is because compute and memory are way cheaper than it once was, you don't have to worry about, this will be somewhat controversial, but you don't have to worry about writing super efficient code in low-level languages. Okay, so we used to have to screw around with all of that, which is a whole thing that you don't have to deal with as much anymore.
Yeah.
Now, some would argue you're wrong, Greg, because the whole shift left, how about shifting left on FinOps? So how do we appropriately leverage services in the cloud, right? I mean, Cloud Zero, local company here that I think have been one of the sort of, that space of cloud cost management is constantly reinventing itself, right? And there was Cloud Health that was one of the pioneers, and I was lucky enough to get some time to work there. And then, the Cloud Zero guys have really built, I think, a set of tools that play more to shifting left for FinOps, to make it easier for engineers to do some of the testing early on so that they don't realize they're inefficiently using the cloud. So there are pieces, I only address that because of what I said, that you still have to be a responsible developer. You're being responsible with different resources today than you were.
Yeah, but I mean, it could also be I write a piece of code and it now needs to run for 10 hours to see if it actually works or not, right? Or it's to compile, right? So at some point, you even had to worry about the time it takes for your code to compile, and you're sitting around waiting before you could actually test. Whereas now, run now, and instantaneously you get that feedback, and it just speeds you up, and it just makes you that much more efficient.
Right, dramatically better. So to me, dramatically better. And then if we sprinkle AI now on top of that, I mean, it's great. And also dramatically better ways to effectively manage with tooling, engineering productivity and performance and execution. You have the jellyfishes of the world, who are building those kinds of tools, DX. I mean, there's a plural site, Flow. I mean, there's tools out there that allow engineering leaders to help their teams become more productive and efficient. Because you can't, I'm a one-note piano player on this too, but no matter what, if you're not measuring something, how the hell can you expect to get better at it, no matter what it is, right? Whether it's getting better non-functionally or getting better functionally, getting better at process, you gotta measure to find out what went wrong and how do you fix it,
So Greg, this has been fantastic. As we always do at the end of the podcast, we leave one non-serious fun question for our guest. So today's question is around superpowers. So not so much, the ability to, super strength or super speed or anything like that. Think of something that you're really, really good at. Doesn't have to be anything related to work at all. Just something, you might be an excellent cook. And then let's see if we can turn that into a power that you could use to fight crime.
Okay, cool. So, this is kind of cool. So I think first of all, people that are my colleagues out there who listen to this, and some people who have worked for me, with me, people I've worked for, would probably laugh out loud when they hear what I say to this. But I think my superpower is being an empath. Okay, which means that I think I have significant skills. And when you say a superpower, it's something you don't have to work at. That's my interpretation of that. It's something that just kind of comes naturally to you. I think being empathetic is that category. In fact, so far, I'm also a Star Trek geek. So I named my consulting company Troy Innovations after Counselor Troy on Star Trek Next Gen. So if anybody out there is familiar. So that's what I think I'm pretty good at, sort of getting inside another person's head pretty quickly, or even getting the vibe on a room pretty quickly in terms of how they're thinking, what they're thinking about, and so forth. So in terms of how I might bring that to solving crimes, I think I'm one of these odd birds that they can bring in after they've pulled someone in. So after the cops have collared somebody, I can help the cops and the DA figure out whether or not the person actually did it. That's what I think I could do to help, so that more people that have done the bad thing get put in jail, and more people that have not but are unfairly in there can get let go. That's what I think I can do.
I was thinking more along the lines of maybe I'm going a little too comic booky, where you could push the empathy towards the person that's committing the crime. So someone is committing a crime. Let's say they're stealing a purse or something, and you can make them feel empathy for the person that they're stealing from, and they're like, oh, she's a single mother, she barely has enough money for food, and I'm taking her purse. I'm gonna let go, and that could be, I don't know what you would call that superpower.
That's an intervention. That's
empathy man.
Yeah, intervention. Empathy man intervenes, anticipating this bad behavior.
No, that too. That was the old Tom Cruise movie. What was that? Minority Report, right?
Right.
Stopping people before they commit they commit the crime. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, Greg, this was awesome. It's always great to talk to you. Definitely would love to have you come back anytime. Just give me the word. And this was great. Thanks again.
No, appreciate the invitation. So, thanks, Rosie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Smells Like Identity Hygiene. Smells Like Identity Hygiene is a production of Sphere Technology Solutions, and our producer is Matthew Flink. Until next time.